this video, you will learn about how the absorption of carbohydrates takes place inside the human body. So, the absorption of carbohydrates in the human body takes place in the small intestine. So, the carbohydrates completely digested and the final small products are present in the small intestine. So, as the small intestine lining are made up of the epithelial cells. So the small intestine have many circular inner foldings. They are known as villi. So these villi have further inner folding known as microvilli. So these villi present in the small intestine, these provides the increased surface area for the absorption. So these microvilli are surrounded by the blood capillaries so that the carbohydrates can be absorbed that will cross these intestinal lining and will enter into the blood circulation. So from the blood they are taken up to their targeted sites or tissues. So as the final end product for the digestion of carbohydrates are the glucose, fructose and galactose. So mostly the carbohydrates final products are the glucose, and the fructose and galactose, if they are present, they are converted into the glucose. And if they are all if fructose and galactose are absorbed in this form, they will be converted in the liver. So when they are taken up by the liver, in the liver they are again converted into the glucose. So in the human body, the blood circulation contains the carbohydrates in the form of glucose. So these are the final end product of the carbohydrate digestion are the glucose, fructose and galactose that are ready for the absorption in the small intestine. So from the small intestine, as these final product of the carbohydration as glucose, fructose and galactose, and fructose and galactose are mostly converted into glucose, and if they are not converted, then when the fructose and galactose they reach to the liver through blood, then in the liver they are again converted into the glucose, because in the human body in the blood circulation the carbohydrate present in the form of glucose. So in the small intestine, as this is the lumen of the small intestine, these monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, and galactose, this is the enterocytes as the intestinal lining that are made up of the epithelial cells. They will cross the intestinal lining and enter into the blood. So from blood, they will be taken up to the liver where this metabolism of these carbohydrates will take place. Then how the transport of the glucose, galactose, and fructose takes place across the intestinal lining or the intestinal cell to the capillary. There are specific transporters and carriers that are present in the intestinal lining or the intestinal cells that are involved in the transport of these monosaccharides to cross the intestinal lining and enter into the blood capillaries. So the glucose and galactose are transported as these are the monosaccharides, the final products of the carbohydrate digestion. So these monosaccharides will enter into the intestinal cells as the epithelial cells through the through spatial glucose transporters as the glucose and galactose. The transporter is the sodium glucose transporter 1, and fructose will be transported through the glucose transporter 5. So this glucose and galactose mechanism for the transport is different from that of the fructose, as the fructose and galactose they will be transported inside the enterocytes or the intestinal cells through a facilitated diffusion, while the glucose are transported into the intestinal cell through other transport mechanism known as the co-transport, sodium co-transport mechanism. So when the glucose and galactose are the protein or the transporter involved is the sodium glucose transporter 1, and for the fructose is the glucose transporter 5. They will enter into the intestinal cells like epithelial cells known as enterocytes, and from here there is the common glucose transporter 2, through which these three types of monosaccharides like glucose, galactose and fructose can pass through it and will enter into the blood capillaries, and from these blood capillaries they will be carried to the liver where the metabolism of these monosaccharides will takes place to perform the different functions and to mm, and to fulfill the needs of the body. Then these glucose, as the glucose and the galactose and fructose are transported through simple facilitated fusion, while the glucose has the different mechanism from both of these. So it is that they require the presence of the sodium. Glucose will always require the presence of the sodium to pass through these transporters. As when they will enter into the intestinal cells, it requires the presence of sodium, and while they enter into the enterocytes, then from here, while they entering into the bloodstream, it does not require the presence of sodium, but they will simply pass through facilitated passive diffusion through the glucose transporter 2. Let's see the detailed mechanism for this glucose transport, that how the glucose are transported. Glucose are transported always along with the presence of the sodium. So this transport mechanism will be known as sodium glucose transporter, and this process is also known as symport, as the symport in which the two molecules are simultaneously uh, um, transported across the transporter inside the cell. So as the glucose will be dependent on the sodium, that glucose will transport only in the presence of the sodium. The sodium is not present, then the glucose will not be transported inside the cell, and then they will not be taken up into the blood, and will not be carried to the liver for metabolism and to perform different functions. So at the one side of this transporter, the glucose will attach, on the other side sodium will attach, and they will be entered into the cell. And from here the glucose will be transported to the glucose transporter too, while the sodium, as the sodium will be again transported out of the cell in exchange with the potassium. So this is known as sodium potassium pump, and this transporter and this sodium potassium ATPase, it requires the presence of the ATP. So in this process the ATP is consumed. So let's see this mechanism in detail, that why it requires the presence of ATP and why the transport of glucose is ATP dependent. That because the glucose is moving across the concentration gradient, as here you can see, this is the inside of the intestinal cells, and this is the outside lumen of the intestine. These are the um, cell membrane, so these proteins are embedded in the membrane. So here the less glucose and here is the more glucose, but it will still move from the against the concentration gradient. But here the sodium concentration is high, here the sodium concentration is low. So at one side the glucose will attach and the other side sodium will attach, and this is the same port, as both molecules will be transported at one time. Now the glucose is transported, so this sodium will again be exchanged for the potassium and to be transported from the cell. So this, the transport of sodium in exchange for the potassium, it requires the presence of the ATP. Sodium will go out and the potassium will come inside, so this sodium will be again used as a transporter from to go to the exchange for the potassium. So it will require the presence of the ATP. So this mechanism requires the presence of the ATP for the exchange of the sodium with the potassium. So this is how the glucose is transported inside the cell, and from the cell they are taken up to the bloodstream through the glucose transporter too, and from there, from the bloodstream, it is traveled and carried to the liver. So this is how the absorption of the carbohydrates takes place.